Friends, I have been dreading this particular Sunday for several weeks. The first, and we all stressed out together about how we would eventually have to figure out this parable. And I have been quaking in my boots ever since. The parable of the dishonest manager probably has as many interpretations as it has readers. This story has been baffling everybody for 2,000 years and continues to stump even the most wise and creative interpreters of Scripture. And today we get to wrestle with it together. At first glance, it's one of Jesus' more interesting parables because the main character is clearly flawed. And he doesn't really have a shift at the end. He's still flawed. And when we read stories like this with flawed main characters, there's a part of us deep down that either wants to see them get their comeuppance or see them make a dramatic return and change for the good. But we don't really get either in this story. The manager is in trouble because he got caught embezzling money from his master. He was the steward, the manager of the funds, and his boss calls him into his office to demand he give an accounting of his management and to warn him that he's about to be fired. Now, if you've ever been fired, what do you do with advance notice? He decides to prepare. He thinks, I have a chance to change my fortunes. And famously says, I am not strong enough to dig, and I am too ashamed to beg. So he hatches a plan that will hopefully gain him some allies for when he is inevitably thrown out of his master's house, no job, and nowhere to live. And his master plan is to find the people that owe his master money and reduce their debt. Now, the mechanism of how he does this isn't totally clear. Is he forgiving the part of the debt that he would have taken as his cut as the manager? Or is he still cheating his master out of his profits? But this time he's doing it Robin Hood style, to steal from the rich to feed the poor. Either way, it seems like he's doing a good thing for a wrong reason. And the biggest surprise comes at the end, when the manager has to face the music with his boss, and his boss is pleased. Luke writes that the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. This, more than anything, is what has confused us all for centuries. The actions of the manager are really not that hard to understand. He doesn't want to end up on the street, nor does he want to get a new job and have to do hard labor to earn his living. So instead, he decides to play Robin Hood and help the poor by reducing their debt to his master. But he doesn't do this out of the goodness of his heart. He does it to get into their good graces so that when he's thrown out of his master's house with no job, maybe one of these people who he helped, lessen their debt will feel obligated to take him in. And as much as we might criticize him for this and for continuing to cheat his employer down to the very last day, the impact is that he does still lessen the burden on those households whose debt he reduced. So it's the words of the master that are the most baffling. The manager still cheating him down to the last moment, and yet the master commends him for acting shrewdly. And Jesus seems to echo this with his advice to the children of light. Make for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth friends, so that when that wealth is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. These are very hard words to understand when the conclusion that Jesus eventually reaches is no one can serve both God and wealth. So it makes me wonder, what exactly was the master commending? And before we go into that, I will give you this nugget. The master doesn't necessarily symbolize God or Jesus, right? Perhaps the master is money. No one can serve two masters. So you always ask yourself, is the character I am symbolizing in some way actually that character? We don't know. What we do know is that the manager is impressed, or the master is impressed with the manager's shrewdness. This word in Greek is phronimos. It is translated as wisely, considerately, providently, or in this case, shrewdly. And it actually doesn't show up in that form anywhere else in the New Testament. It's the adverb form of another word, though, which is phronimos, which means wise, considerate, thoughtful, prudent, or discreet. So why the grammar lesson? This word, related to shrewdly, does show up other places in the New Testament, and one of them is a very famous verse from Matthew. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. It's related to the same word used here and translated as shrewdly, wise. The master appears to be complimenting the manager on making a smart choice that secures his future. But arguably, the manager's original practice of embezzlement accomplished the same goal. So what makes this choice, the choice to reduce the debt of others, commendable? Especially if he's not really doing it for their benefit. And here's my theory. I think this parable is very similar in structure to the parable of the prodigal son, which is very beloved, very well-known sermon, very well-known prodigal son, very well-known parable. You can tell I'm nervous. Their structure follows the same pattern. We have a misbehaving subordinate, a son or manager, who is cheating money that they've been entrusted away from a wealthy superior, in this case a father or a master of the house. And both have to face the consequences of their bad choices. Both of them are facing the possibility of losing everything and are trying to find a safe place to live so they don't end up on the street. But their approach to this is very different. The prodigal son is filled with remorse and humbles himself before his father in a deeply moving moment. He only hopes to be able to live in his father's house as a servant. The manager, however, is filled with fear. He tries to ingratiate himself with his master's debtors in hopes of being welcomed into their home after he's fired and has nowhere to go. One is acting out of love and remorse. The other is acting out of fear and pride. But they have one important thing in common. Both men, after squandering the money that was entrusted to them, are faced with losing everything, So they shift their focus away from wealth and towards relationships. They do it differently. The prodigal son is humble, remorseful. The manager, however, is canny and manipulative, but ultimately they both decide to focus on building relationships rather than building or squandering wealth. And ultimately, I think this is the wisdom that the master could be commending. It does track with Jesus' ultimate and often repeated conclusion: no one can serve both God and wealth. And it tracks with Jesus' summary of the law: love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Clearly, Jesus is cautioning us over and over about the dangers of greed. He speaks more about caring for the poor and avoiding the corruptive power of money more than any other topic. And he also wants us to focus our efforts on building relationships rather than building wealth. So I wonder, what can we learn from this strange parable, especially when we are all stuck in a world where we do need at least some money to survive? We as a church and we as individuals and families have to figure out what to do. We need at least some money. Individuals and families use it to buy food, pay for shelter, education, healthcare. Churches need money to pay their staff, to fund their ministries. So what can we learn from this strange parable? How can we learn how to be shrewd? To be wise like the man who built his house on a rock? I think the answer is learn from the manager and the prodigal son and focus on people. Focus on relationships. Be content with having enough. Be generous. Help those who are in need. Do all the good you can for all the people you can. And it's the season of creation, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, I think the answer is the same for how we interact with the world, the natural world around us. Rather than hoarding resources or squandering them, focus on building a relationship with creation. And when we are faced with difficult choices, as we often will be, as a church and as individuals and as families, we can ask ourselves, which choice looks like loving my neighbor? Because at the end of the day, it's not the pennies that matter most. It's the people.